Okay, well, welcome to How to Disagree. This evening, we're delighted to have Calvin Robinson join us. Calvin has been a teacher for many years, but he's probably better known for his recent musings in The Telegraph, among other publications on quite a diverse range of topics, but focusing mainly on things like critical race theory, the Black Lives Matter movement. We're really happy to have him with us this evening, very topical. And we'll just start off a little bit about your background, Calvin, where you come from, what inspired you to get into teaching.
Sure. Well, I'm from the East Midlands, miners town, Mansfield, Nottinghamshire. I had an interesting time at school myself. I didn't really enjoy it. When you go through teacher training, they always say, who inspired you? Which teacher was it that made you want to become a teacher? And honestly, I did have a few good ones throughout my time, but honestly, I didn't really have anyone that inspired me. And I wanted to become the teacher that I wish I had when I was at school. And that's always been my inspiration. But the reason I got into teaching was because I was in the tech industry. I worked in mobile apps and web development and that kind of thing. And that was very, very fun, really good. But we were recruiting from, outsourcing all our work to East Asia, Eastern Europe. I was kind of like, well, why are we doing that? Why can't we find homegrown talent? And we'd have people come to us with decent CVs, but no knowledge and no skills. So it just wouldn't work out for us. And I think this is along the same time that I was kind of looking to be more fulfilled in my work as well, rather than chasing money and trying to not necessarily give something back, because that sounds pretentious, but just trying to live a more fulfilling life. And I think I was either arrogant or naive enough to think that I could make a difference in this area, because I looked at what's going on and I saw that there's a massive gap. There's a digital skills deficit in the UK, and our young people aren't learning programming, at least as they should be. And this is around the time that Michael Gove was the education secretary, fantastic education secretary, by the way, who put into place this new computing curriculum, which took away all the rubbish IT stuff, Microsoft Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and replaced it with actual programming that kids needed to be learning in order to enter our industry. So I entered teaching from a very utilitarian perspective, and that's not my outlook anymore. As an educationist, I think education is an end in and of itself, and knowledge is so important to what we do. But I entered because I wanted to help create more computer programmers.
That's fascinating. And do you feel that we're still sort of reaping the benefits from that now, from all the work that was done under Michael Gove when he was education secretary? Are students still reaping the benefits from that? Has the economy reaped the benefits of some of that work?
Good question. So yeah, I think in a lot of ways we are reaping the benefits. We're seeing much better results. The curriculum is far more rigorous. History in particular, a lot of subjects we're still struggling in computer science, and that's mainly because we can't actually recruit the teachers. I was part of the DFE had a drive, Get Into Teaching was the ad campaign that I was involved in, trying to encourage more people to become teachers. But when you can go and work for Goldman Sachs and then 10 times as much, it's not the biggest motivating factor. So we're still struggling with that in our subjects. But as a whole, I think the reforms that Gove put in place are fantastic, and they are working, and we are reaping the benefits now, or young people are reaping the benefits now, thankfully. So I hope those changes stay. In fact, I'd love to see him return. And I know there's going to be a reshuffle soon. It'd be fantastic if he could finish off the last bits of the revolution that he started. Tom Bennett did that really, really good report on behavior.
Yeah,
I think that's the key area in education. I work with a lot of schools doing my consulting, and I see that the same problems, it doesn't matter where you go, you see the same issues. Low-level disruption causes so much lost time, lost learning, and we just need to stamp that out. And if people took on board, Tom Bennett's report and the findings of that, and what's great schools, Mark's school, Bedford Free School, Dixon's Trinity, Michaela, schools like that are doing great stuff, but there are only a handful of them doing it, and you can't get to the curriculum. It doesn't matter how good your curriculum is if behavior is still an issue in your school.
Fascinating. So, Calvin, we'll start. Before I get into some of the questions that I have, I should say to people who are watching this, you can use the Q&A function to ask questions, and then we'll ask them at the end and get Calvin's views on topics that are of interest to you. So just going back a little bit earlier into your own life, Calvin, what was your favourite subject at school, and what was your sort of favourite part of school life? I mean, you were saying that you didn't always have the best time, but was there a subject that really sort of stood out for you, and a favourite part of your school life that has really sort of stayed with you and inspired you to some extent to follow the career that you have?
Well, I loved English and English literature. I loved reading, I loved writing. They were always a passion of mine at school, but my natural talent was in computing. So I was always pushed into that direction. And that's the career that I initially took. But I think I've shifted naturally back into, I do a lot more writing now than I do teaching, for example.
Sure.
So I've kind of shifted back into that area, which was my first passion. I loved drama as well, performing arts, anything like that. But in school, I love learning now. I'm studying again. I do love learning, and I think you can never read too much. But
Yes.
in school, I just didn't feel challenged. I don't think. I went to,
No.
It was a former grammar school. It was comprehensive in the Midlands. It was okay. I was probably, for the most part, one of the only ethnic minorities in my school, and I don't think people knew how to approach me, or how to kind of, I don't know, my teachers just didn't know how to get the best out of me. It was really frustrating because as a teenager, I just never felt pushed or challenged. I was bored quite often. I ended up turning into the class clown quite a bit as well, to my own detriment. Looking back, I'm really annoyed at myself, because if I was in my own class, I'd be like, no, you need to knuckle down and get on with stuff. But,
And do you think that the lack of feeling challenged was down to the curriculum or down to the teachers, or a combination of both?
I think it's absolutely down to both.
Yeah. Okay.
It's just the challenge was always, how do we handle Calvin? How do we approach Calvin? Because they always saw me as different, and it's like, this is the problem that we have. I talk a lot about the soft bigotry of low expectations, because people always expect ethnic minorities to need a different approach or to need different standards. It's not about that. It's about raising expectations and raising standards for all children, and that's how they thrive.
Yes.
They rise to meet your standards. If you lower them, then you lower their outcomes.
That's true. So a little bit later on, I mean, you first came to my attention when I started to read some of your stuff around political indoctrination of pupils in schools, and your worries that some schools were allowing staff views to affect balance in the classroom. When did you have you always been political, or was it a sort of period of focus on teaching, and then you really sort of started to think in broader terms about teaching and about education policy and about the political decisions that affect those things?
No, it's two different things that were happening at the same time. So when I left tech, I got involved in local politics because I wanted to change things in the area that I lived in and try to make a difference. And we did campaigns, like, for example, on our high streets, we made sure that all the buses that went up that high street, because there were so many of them, were green, environmentally friendly. We petitioned the Mayor of London and got things done. And that was fantastic. And we did all that through our residents association. But that gave me a taste for, you can make a difference if you just stand up and do stuff rather than sitting around moaning about it.
Okay.
So I got involved in local politics at the same time as I got involved in teaching. And my passion for both of them grew at the same time. And while I was, learning to teach, I was finding so many issues that I was kind of like, is that really how things are done? Well, I don't know yet. I'm still learning. So I'll go with the flow for now. When they say things like, children aren't misbehaving, they're just trying to communicate with you in their own way. Or when they say children should lead the learning, I'm like, should they? They don't know what they don't know, though. Surely we're the experts. But hey, you're the expert at the moment. I'm still learning. I'll go with the flow. But eventually I kind of figured that, a lot of this stuff that I was being taught was nonsense. And I think the biggest problem with teaching is teacher training. But I started to write about it. I started to blog about it. I stuck my head above the parapet. Probably shouldn't have done. Probably should have left teaching and started writing about something. But writing about it while you're still there raises a few eyebrows. And there's just so many issues to address. And like I said, teacher training is one of the big ones. But I think the political indoctrination was massive, and that was the most eye-opening thing for me, because obviously we all know that teachers tend to be left-wing, but I always assumed that was fine because it just, it just attracts a certain type of person. Sure. What I didn't realize was they were pushing their views onto young people, and that's very dangerous and very worrying. That concerned me so much.
Okay. And did you feel that during this time you were there were other teachers who felt the same way as you, but who were sort of reticent to speak out for fear of being ostracized, or did you get the feeling that a lot of people who you were working with and teaching alongside did share the same views as you, and there were concerns over teacher training and other areas?
No, no. At first, I felt very alone. I felt very isolated. I remember a general election, many general elections ago now. We've had so many, and people were asking me, well, people just saying in general, like, who are you voting for? And I was, yeah, for Conservative. And the reaction, the vitriolic reaction that I received, that blew me away. I didn't realize that it would be so divisive to say you're voting for one of the majority parties in the country. There was just an assumption that everyone voted Labour, and I'm sure there were other Tories there, but they kept quiet because they knew better. I didn't know better at the time. I mean, I know now, but I think I reached out online and I found there was a website called Conservative Teachers, which is no longer around.
But I'm interested because I imagine that a lot of teachers who may have had those views would have been frightened to speak out, and yet you weren't. Why? Because you felt that this was a campaign worth fighting for, or it was important to air your views, even if doing so was a potential risk to your career or to your reputation.
Yeah, I think it comes down to principles, and
yeah.
As a man of faith, as a Christian, I think I would die for my principles.
Okay.
That's that important to me. Whereas I get other people have different priorities, and that's fine. I'm not judging anyone. I'm just saying that, you know, I will stick my head above the parapet, because I think if that helps other people also join the cause, fantastic.
Yeah.
But if that also means that I lose my head in the process, at least I know I died trying, or died fighting for a good cause.
Interesting. So next question, and really the sort of the theme of the conversation this evening. What do you think is the key to disagreeing well with people? I mean, we're now living in times which are very toxic, very divisive. You know, views on everything are proffered on Twitter and Facebook, and we've seen this sort of march of kind of identitarian politics and viewing, you know, social phenomena and politics through the prism of skin color and all these sorts of things. Is there a way that we can have those kinds of conversations, which can be very emotive and very difficult to have, in a way that is more respectful, that does allow people to air their views in a way that this is not quite as divisive?
Yeah, I'm starting. I think first and foremost, we just got to acknowledge that we're all people, right? So we won't always get it right. I certainly don't. There are many debates I've had on Twitter where the next morning I thought, you know what, I probably shouldn't have said that. But you know what I try to do is apologize. So if I've said something wrong, I'll either publicly or privately message that person and say, you know what, I probably shouldn't have said that. What I meant was this. That didn't quite come across well. And then the onus is on the next person to forgive. So when someone does the same to me and they apologize, you know, I accept your apology. We all make mistakes and move on. That's the thing we're missing at the moment: the apology and the forgiveness. This whole, I know people don't like the term.
Has social media, has the ease with which people can comment or chastise or criticize made it difficult, made it more difficult to have that kind of an environment in which we do apologize if we think that we've said something that's out of line?
Yeah, because it's dehumanizing, isn't it? There's a barrier between you and the other person, so they don't see you as a man. They see you as an avatar, or they see you as, you know. So when they're arguing, they're not arguing you; they're arguing an idea in their head, and it's all about reminding people that you're a person at the other end of the keyboard. And I think social media is a mistake, to be honest. It's so toxic, but it has its positives. You know, I've met people like you and Mark Lahane, and you can connect with people who are like-minded and share ideas and experience. Great, but there's so much toxicity and so much negativity that it's difficult to balance it sometimes. But I just think reminding each other that we are all human, we're all flawed, we all make mistakes, and that's okay. And that, you know, we're not always arguing to prove that we're right either. Sometimes when I'm having a debate, I'm checking my own perspective and finding out maybe if there's a different way, and let's not always assume that we are right. And even if we are, that doesn't mean we're on the right side. Quite often it gets portrayed that, you know, to be against what I believe means you're not just wrong, but you're bad or you're evil. Or scum is the common term. And I just think that's the danger. That's so divisive. Let's let's not assume people are bad people just because they're wrong, because what happens then is whatever the people happen to be fighting, they inherit those traits. For example, the people that are fighting racism online, if they see someone that they perceive to be racist, they just decide it's okay for them to attack that person, even in a racist way, because that person is a bad person. And that's
Yes.
what I'm receiving a lot of at the moment. And it's really difficult to challenge that.
And talking about people who we might disagree with or take umbrage with what they say, is there anybody in particular that comes to mind who you disagree with, that you admire, and who would that be, and why? What about them do you admire, even though you may not agree with their views?
Yeah, I mean, Claire Fox comes to mind straight away because I know you've had her on this show. I
Yeah.
think she's a fantastic woman. We don't agree on a lot of things. I know she doesn't use the left and right divide anymore, but I see Claire as someone from the left, especially economically, and I consider myself right wing. So there are so many things we disagree on, but we always find common ground, and that usually ends up being around reasoned debate and having conversations and finding out where that common ground is respectfully. Yes. And I really admire Claire for that, because she's led the way in that movement her whole career. But there are a few head teachers that I admire, respect, that I don't agree with politically. And
yeah,
I think that's a good question, because I think if more of us could spend time thinking about who we don't agree with, that we do see traits that we admire. I think that's a good perspective to take.
So going back to something you said earlier, so you were talking about the sort of political indoctrination of pupils in schools by teachers, and that was something that you first noticed when you were a teacher. Could you give us a little bit of a historic perspective of this? I mean, we now see it as a really serious problem, but has this been something that's been going on in schools for some time? Has it become worse recently? Why? What has triggered that? Is it sort of social justice movements that we've seen in the last couple of years? So is this sort of something that becomes a more ingrained problem as a reflection of those kinds of movements, and the rest of the time it's not quite as bad? Or is this something which has become progressively problematic in schools?
Yes, to all of that. I first really noticed it over Brexit, when I saw that there was very much one perspective in that Brexit is bad. People who believe in Brexit are xenophobic, racists, and shouldn't be trusted. And that fell in line, that very much aligned with the whole idea that Tories are evil, Tory scum, Tories don't care about people, Tories don't like the NHS, and Labour is the party for people that care about people. Labour is the party of the NHS, and it was very binary. And that I kind of started to see not just conversations that teachers were having with pupils, but also resources on websites like TES, and these are teacher resource websites that thousands or hundreds of thousands of teachers access every day. But you're right, it usually does come down to the social justice warrior issues, because Black History Month was another one where I looked on these websites, and the majority of the resources on there had such. So I went on there, I thought, let me see if there are any that have critical race theory elements in them, but the majority had this. And this is, we all know the theory by now of white privilege and white people being oppressors, Black people being victims. It's a very toxic, divisive ideology. But most of the resources on there for Black History Month on these teacher resource websites were steeped in critical race theory, which was very worrying, which is why myself and a number of other people, some of whom I believe are in the audience tonight, put together some alternative resources for teachers to access that you could teach about Black history, because we understand that a lot of people want to address racial inequalities, whether they're historic or present, but do so without compromising yourself, because to teach these things like white privilege as if they are fact is illegal. It is breaking the Education Act of 1996, which states that schools need to impart political neutrality. And so many schools have been getting away with doing this kind of thing for so long, because again, they assume they're right and they're on the right side of history, because they're the good guys. So it's okay for them to do it. Whereas if someone else was to do it from a different political perspective, they would be indoctrinating, they would be bad.
And so when you presented these alternative teaching materials, was there hostility to that from the teaching community, or did a lot of them think, okay, yes, you have a point, we do need a bit more balance here?
like to think there will be a bit of both. It's
Okay.
always difficult to tell because on social media you tend to get the vocal minority, don't you? And there was a lot of hostility. There still is. There's people tweeting right now about a new report from the EHRC, and people just don't get it. Again, they believe because from their perspective, this country is systemically racist and institutionally racist, that it's okay to skew things politically in one minority's favor because you're correcting for an injustice that they see. But what I'm trying to say is that not everyone sees the world in that way, and not everyone acknowledges that. I don't believe that this country is systemically or institutionally racist. I do think racism occurs in our society, and we need to stamp that out. But I don't think Britain is a racist country. So we're at odds there on that argument. So to kind of overcorrect and address based on their perspective is kind of disregarding mine, and their argument is all about lived experiences. So to disregard my argument kind of debunks their own theory.
Yeah.
But
so I'm interested to know why. So if you could talk to just very briefly about critical race theory, just where it came from and what fundamentally it's talking about.
Yeah. So it came from the States. It came from Harvard. It's been around for decades, but it's kind of grown since the George Floyd incident and Black Lives Matter movement took over the summer. And it is essentially, and I'm oversimplifying here, but it is essentially saying that the West is racist. White is no longer just a skin color. Whiteness is a identity, and they want to readdress the power struggle between white people and minorities. And what they essentially say is that white people have been oppressing minorities for decades or centuries, and now they want to rebalance the situation. And they're redefining racism from what I understand it to be, which is prejudice or discrimination towards someone based on their skin color. They're redefining that to a power struggle between white people and non-white people. So by its design, it's divisive. It's splitting people up into either white or non-white, or as we call them over here, BME. And it's putting measures into place what they think are going to support non-white people, but actually it's causing that rift to further divide. And for example, in schools, we're saying that you're from an ethnic minority background, therefore we're not going to expect the same standards from you, as we mentioned earlier. But that's kind of, we're telling young Black kids, for example, that this country is racist. They've got so many hurdles in front of them, so many barriers to overcome, that we're drilling this victimhood mentality into them. We're giving them these excuses, and we're telling them their life is going to be tough, rather than saying, actually, you know what, this is a free country. You've got equal opportunities. You can become anything you want if you set your mind to it and work hard enough, which is the message we should be saying. We should be, again, raising those standards, raising those expectations for all kids, and then they will thrive. But for some reason, we think we're doing them a favor. We think we're doing people a favor by treating them specially, and that's not helpful.
So I'm curious to understand why critical race theory was absorbed so uncritically into the British curriculum. Did teachers here already have views that were similar to those espoused by the theory, and it just so happens that along comes a theory that neatly fits that narrative and explains the worldview? Or did they learn about it and were made aware of it and then started to sort of think, okay, yes, this makes sense to me? I'm saying, were those views already there, and CRT was the trigger for them beginning to espouse them to their students and to their peers?
So I don't think the views were already there. I think there were some people that are quite patronizing naturally and just assume that Black people need special treatment. But as a whole, I don't think those views were there. What's happened is they've wrapped this critical race theory, into what they call anti-racism. And it's a very, very positive message. It's like, of course you want to be anti-racist, don't you? Because what's the opposite of being anti-racist? Yes. That's racist. And nobody wants to be racist. So therefore, if you want to be anti-racist, you have to follow these principles, because these are the way we solve racism. And it's who wants to stand up and argue against that? And what I'm hearing from people who are jumping on board with this are saying, oh, I've recently learned that because of my white privilege, X, Y, Z, and that falls in line with their argument, which is educate yourself, which essentially means think like we do. And that's what's happening. People are being given these books, people are given literature and teaching resources that are all from one political ideology, which is a hard left critical race theory, and being told this is the way to solve racial injustices that exist. But you wouldn't know about these racial injustices because you're white. So take our word for it and follow this guidebook. why wouldn't you?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So what then is the alternative to anti-racism? Is it a more balanced education, and is that the responsibility of teachers? Should the Department for Education be doing more work in that area? Does it come down to legislation? Does it come down to guidance? Does it come down to parenting?
So I think the opposite of anti-racism is liberalism. It is
Right.
treating people equally, expecting everyone to be an individual, not assigning people to labels or boxes, not assuming that someone's skin color happens to be the core of their identity because it's meaningless. It's a social construct. Race means nothing. I happen to be mixed race because I've got a black father and a white mother. That doesn't say anything about my identity. My identity comes from my faith, from my nationality, from the area I grew up, from a whole host of different things, from my profession, things that I can choose and things that I can change, not my immutable characteristics. And the way to fix that is to be colorblind. It is to take the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. approach of just not seeing people by the color of their skin and seeing people for their characteristic, for their character, the content of their character, the things, the way people present themselves and the things that people put out there about themselves. And to present equal opportunities, to make sure everyone, no matter their skin color, has an opportunity to do something. Not saying because you're black you get a special opportunity, or because you're white you don't get access to this opportunity. That breeds resentment and embarrassment.
Right.
I would never want to get a job because I'm mixed race.
No,
I'll be so offended by that.
So what are is there evidence that the effects of teaching critical race theory at school are pernicious in the long term? Because won't some people say, well, kids learn all sorts of things at school, and then maturity enables us to look at the world in a more objective and a more balanced way?
Yeah, I mean, we're yet to see the results of this, but I don't think it's ever a good thing to politically indoctrinate. I don't think it's ever a good thing to only have one perspective. Schools should either be completely neutral or present both sides of the argument. And I just think we need to be more evidence informed as a profession. We need to look into research, and we need to critically challenge these ideas, any idea that we want to teach. That's what, the curriculum was put together so well. And then we're kind of just adapting other ideologies into it and squishing them in and saying, oh, well, we're going to teach this because it's a good thing. How do we know it's a good thing? Academia used to be good at this, at challenging ideas. Even academia now in the universities, they're shutting down debate and shutting down criticism. It's so dangerous.
So who should be leading the charge against this, besides people like you and I? Is it the responsibility of, do you think politicians have done a good enough job in speaking up against this?
I think what the Equalities Minister said in the Houses of Parliament the other day about Black Lives Matter and about critical race theory was fantastic. That was exactly what I've been waiting for a minister to stand up and say, first of all, critical race theory is wrong. It's divisive. It's toxic. We don't want to see it in our schools. It's illegal. For a politician to stand up and say that is great. But then now people need to acknowledge that and take that on board.
Should there be more work from the unions in this regard? I suppose they would be fairly hostile to that.
The unions are the biggest problem. The unions are absolutely militant. We saw the other day that the NEU spent over £500,000 during the last general election, and they claim they're not political. It's disgusting. Everything they do is anti-government just because it's a Tory government. They've never got anything positive to contribute. They don't look after their members. They're not worried about children or teachers. They're just worried about their own political agenda, and I can't support the teachers union at all.
Okay, right. No ambiguity there then. So now moving on a little bit. So you're currently advising Laurence Fox's recently launched Reclaim Party. Can you tell us a bit about that? So what do you guys hope to achieve, and how do you think it can or will affect change?
So, I mean, I offer political consultancy to many people. In the last week, I've consulted with ministers and members of Parliament. And yes, I'm advising Laurence Fox as well. And I think what he's doing is fantastic because it is this stuff. It's speaking on the cultural issues, much like the Brexit Party spoke up on Brexit. It is holding the government to account and saying that every man cares about this stuff. You need to as well. And we don't really have that in Parliament at the moment. Her Majesty's most loyal opposition are not really offering any opposition. Throughout lockdown, they've been going with the flow, and they're so woke that they won't stand up on the cultural issues. Even though the Labour Party used to be the party of the working class, they've forgotten their roots. You know,
Yes.
that's why they lost the Red Wall, because they're not connected with people up there in the real core of the country that care about normal, everyday, common sense issues. They've lost their common sense values, I think. You know,
Yes.
the Labour Party is headed up by a Knight of the Realm, barrister, and it's more middle class than the Tories. I think more of the Labour front bench went to top quality universities than Conservatives. So they've lost that connection. So what needs to happen in UK politics, in British politics, is people from the outskirts, and I don't think Reclaim is going to be left wing or right wing, but
No.
parties from the outskirts need to put pressure on the government to remind the government what the normal everyman cares about, to be a voice for the silent majority.
Okay. And is that's the responsibility of campaigns and politicians together, I suppose.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
parents on the educational issues. So in terms of causes like the ones that you're interested in and are involved in, what advice would you give to somebody starting out today who wanted to win people over to a cause? I mean, especially in the sorts of stuff that you're involved in, which is, you know, it is emotive and people have very strong views on it. How do you try to win the debate? Is it through your writing? Is it through speaking to as many people as possible? Is it pointing out evidence to people and why this balanced approach, especially when it comes to race, is so important? Is there sort of, there's no magic button, I suppose, but what is it a mix of that you think wins people over to a cause?
So I know it sounds counterintuitive, but I never set out to win the debate. I just put my perspective out there. I do the research, I get the evidence together, I write my opinion, and I publish it and let people run with it. And I think people publish opposing opinions, and then hopefully people will take them all on board and work out their own minds for themselves. That's what I would like to see. I think if you go into a debate wanting to win, you're assuming that you're right. And again, that comes into all the worrying stuff we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
I mean, I like to think I'm right, but I don't know that I'm right. So I'm going to put my point out there, and people can weigh up the facts for themselves, and hopefully they'll agree with me.
One final question from me, Calvin, before we move on to some questions from the audience. So finally, our How to Disagree series, we like to end on thoughts from our guest on how do we get people to disagree better. So these are very emotive, very divisive issues. People feel very strongly about them, especially in terms of critical race theory. Is there a way for people to discuss these things in a more balanced way? And especially, I wonder, students in school, is there a way that pupils can get together and talk about these sorts of issues among themselves, maybe with a little bit less guidance from the teacher, if our view now is that teachers are, you know, far more ideological than they should be? Is there a way around that?
Yeah, I think from a pupil's perspective, just making their voices heard is great. You know, we've got enough student leadership programs or student voice programs in schools, making sure that adults aren't assuming they know what you believe, and letting them know what you believe and what you feel about the way you've been taught or what you've been taught. Making sure people have a voice. But for the general public, I think what I talked about earlier, having forgiveness and being able to apologize are the two core essential skills in having a reasoned debate. And if we're talking about social media, having a bit of common sense and perspective, and remembering that these are human beings on the other end. We all forget it, myself included, when we're arguing with people online. And if someone's being abusive, don't argue back, block, mute, doesn't matter. You know, don't let it affect you. It can affect your well-being, especially when you get hundreds of people tweeting nasty things at you once. Just remember, it doesn't matter. Block, mute, and get on with your life.
Great advice. So we'll move onto some questions from the audience. So I'll start with, this is a good one from Howard Sherwood. He's asking, how responsible is the child-centered approach to school education for the sensitivities and readiness to take offence that currently stifles open debate?
I think whenever we mention the word child-centered, I get a bit worried, because it kind of, we always have to remember that as much as I'm not trying to teach a trash on here, by the way. I know I've talked a lot about the things that teachers do badly, but teachers are fantastic at what they do, in that they are the subject matter experts. They are the person with the most knowledge in the room, and their job is to impart that knowledge And whenever we talk about child-centered things, we tend to skew the conversation more towards the child being the leader and the child being the expert. And we say things like the child is the expert in what they know, or the child is the expert in their learning. No, they're not. We are the experts in the teaching and the learning. We are experts in what they know, what they don't know. And it's our job to make sure we pass on as much knowledge as possible. So we need to avoid that whole conversation, really.
Okay.
And the readiness to the sensitivities and readiness to take offense is absolutely key. Thank you for raising that, Howard, because we absolutely need to teach young people that it's okay to be offended. It doesn't mean anything. And B, that we shouldn't try to cause offense. So there's two key things there. You know, when I'm offended, often it's me choosing to take offense, and I've got to remember that. But also, I've got to also bear in mind, I'm not trying to cause offense to people, because that's not kind, is it?
Yes. Great, thanks, Calvin. So next question is from Bruce Newsom. How early in schooling should we be teaching logic and empiricism?
I don't think these
probably
are
especially important in these times.
Yeah, I don't think these are discrete skills that we teach. I think these are things that are embedded in most subject areas, and it's down to the way that we teach. So I think always from the beginning is the answer to that.
Yeah, fantastic. Right, we'll move on to another question. So did you, there was a piece, I think, from some UCL academics, with that expressing concern about Kemi Badenoch's speech, saying that she sort of misrepresented critical race theory. What would you say about that?
I would say people can read up on what critical race theory is for themselves and decide if they think she's misrepresented it. I don't think she has. I think what she said was the best thing I've seen in Parliament in years. It really excited me because she laid it out very clearly, very sensibly, and said, this is not okay. Don't do this. You know, don't teach political ideologies as facts. That's clear. There's nothing, there's no agenda behind that. So I think people on the left have tried to fight back with all kinds of nonsense, saying, oh, she's saying you can't teach about racial inequalities, or she's saying you can't teach. In fact, she's not even saying you can't teach CRT. She's saying you can't teach it as fact. You can't teach political ideologies unchallenged, uncontested. That makes sense. And if you're fighting against that, you need to look at yourself and think, what am I arguing here?
Yes, yes. Another question, do you have, well, what are your views on Scotland's new hate crime bill?
Oof. The single most worrying piece of legislation in our lifetime. It could essentially make the Bible illegal. I know that's a bit of hyperbole, but the idea that to hate is a crime. I don't think hate is good. As a Christian, someone tweeted earlier today, you know, Christ never said don't have enemies. He just said love them. So I don't think that's pretty reticent. But also the idea that we can say that what you are saying is illegal is so dangerous, because if it depends what political party is in power, or depends what ideology the judge has who's looking at this, or just the idea that what I say can get me locked up for someone else disagreeing with it, whether I meant it to be offensive or not, whether if you're causing violence or you're causing damage to someone, absolutely there should be consequences. But I believe in freedom of speech so much, and it worries me that a lot of people don't seem to care about it anymore.
Yes. Well, speaking about freedom of speech, I have a question. So we've done quite a lot of work and commentary and analysis on cancel culture, which I think is very worrying. What is the relationship between critical race theory and cancel culture? Is CRT feeding into this feeling among groups of people, student unions at universities? Is it sort of, are they justifying cancelling people on CRT, on a sort of CRT basis, or sort of anti-racism? Does one feed into the other?
Absolutely, it's insidious. The whole idea, they link them together because the whole idea is they want to destroy our way of life. And I know that sounds dramatic, but they don't believe in capitalism. They think it's dangerous and bad, so they call it white capitalism. They don't believe in the family structure, so they call it the white family structure. And families are the essential of our way of life. Our communities start in family, our education starts in family. Respect, law, everything starts in the family structure. So to break that down is to break down our way of life. We know, movements like Black Lives Matter are using critical race theory, but also using Marxist ideologies of being against the family, being against capitalism, being quite anti-Semitic, and wanting to defund the police. Again, these are all power plays. These are all ways of breaking down what we see as civilized life so that they can rebuild it in their own image. And that is something we should all be worried about.
We're now seeing, I think, CRT sort of affecting impartiality at the BBC, and it's now enveloped into unconscious bias training at many organisations and institutions. Is this, I suppose, my final question is this sort of so big and it's snowballed so much that in a way we're fighting a losing battle, or do you still remain optimistic? Do you still believe that the tide can be pushed back against this, and balance and evidence can displace sentiment?
So I think, there's evidence out there. So unconscious bias training, if it's obligatory, it doesn't work. It has a detrimental effect. But companies like BBC did reports on this and came to those findings, yet they'll still implement unconscious bias training. We've got unconscious bias training in the government. It's everywhere. And it is steeped in critical race theory. So all these things link together. And it depends what day you ask me on whether I'm optimistic or not. Some days I'll say we've already lost the culture wars, and now it's about coming back from that, because they've taken over all our public institutions, from the government to the Quangos to the police force to the BBC. They're everywhere. So this.
But if the solution to that is education, is there an argument to be made to say this is a generational thing, or do we have to wait until we have a new generation of leaders that where they've been educated in institutions or by teachers or among their peers, where there is a greater emphasis on impartiality and objectivity, or are we going to have a solution a bit quicker than that?
No, you're right. It is generational, and it will require a whole generation of young people that have been brought up to think critically and challenge, because evidence is out there, but no one's addressing it, no one's looking at it. But we're not there yet, so we don't have a whole generation that are being taught to think critically, that are being taught to be evidence informed. So when we get to that point, we'll know we're on the right track. But for now, we're not there. So, which is why sometimes I think we've already lost the battle, and we need to kind of readdress it and think, how can we reverse that long march through the institutions?
Okay, well, hopefully I can show your optimism. I think I do to some extent, but I do worry when I see what's going on at the moment. But Calvin, it was a real pleasure to have you this evening. We really appreciate it. Very interesting conversation, and thank you to everybody who joined us tonight. We'll be putting the whole webinar and clips up on YouTube and Facebook tomorrow, and we welcome any feedback. We're still new to this and occasionally have technical glitches, but any feedback would be very welcome, and we really hope that you enjoyed this evening's webinar and hope to see you again for the next one. Calvin, thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.